Bible Toons Studio presents
The widow's oil, the miracle that never ran out. The sound of a knock at the door is usually ordinary. It is the rhythm of daily life. A neighbor returning a borrowed tool, a merchant selling grain, a friend passing by to share news. But for one woman in ancient Israel, that hollow thud against the wood was not ordinary. It was the sound of a death sentence. She stood on the other side of the door, her back pressed hard against the rough clay wall, her lungs burning because she was afraid to exhale. She wasn't hiding from a thief in the night. She wasn't hiding from an invading army marching from the north. She was hiding from a simple, brutal, legal reality: debt. The house was silent, save for the shallow breathing of her two sons huddled in the corner. They looked at her with wide, confused eyes, sensing the terror radiating from their mother. Her husband was dead, the protector of the home, the provider, the priest of their family. He was gone, buried, and in the harsh economic laws of her time, grief was a luxury she couldn't afford. Because the creditor had come. He didn't want money. He knew she had none. He had already calculated the value of her furniture, her livestock, her land. It wasn't enough. So he came for the only asset she had left. He wanted her sons. Imagine the horror that gripped her throat. To lose your husband is a tragedy that breaks the heart. But to have your children ripped from your arms, to watch them be dragged away to work in the fields of a stranger, to be treated as property, to pay off a debt they didn't create, that is not just a tragedy. That is a nightmare. She looked around her room. It was a picture of desolation. Bare walls where tapestries once hung, empty shelves where grain used to be stored. The silence of poverty screamed in her ears. She had nothing left to sell, nothing left to trade. The well of hope had run dry. But she was wrong. In the corner of a shelf pushed back into the shadows and covered in dust, sat a small clay jar. It wasn't much. It looked like nothing, perhaps enough for one last meal or one anointing. But that disregarded flask was the seed of a miracle that was about to change everything. To understand the weight of this moment, we have to understand the desperation of the woman standing in that room. This woman wasn't a stranger to God. She wasn't someone who had squandered her money on riotous living. The scriptures tell us her husband was one of the sons of the prophets. He was a student of Elisha. He was a man who had dedicated his life to the study of Torah and the service of Yahweh. They were a ministry family. They had done everything right. They had lived a faithful life. They had served the community. And yet, here she was, destitute, alone, terrified. It is a question that echoes through the ages, isn't it? It is the question that keeps us awake at 3 a.m. Why do bad things happen to faithful people? Why does the bill collector come even when you've prayed? Why does the diagnosis come when you've served? Why does the bank account run dry when you have given your tithe? The enemy was at the door, and God seemed silent. But she didn't stay paralyzed behind that wood. Desperation fueled her. She knew she couldn't fight the creditor physically. He was too strong. She couldn't fight him legally. The law was on his side. So she fought him spiritually. She ran. She didn't run to her family, and she didn't run to the king. She ran to the man of God. She found Elisha, the prophet who had succeeded Elijah. Elisha, the man who had seen the chariots of fire, the man who carried the double portion of the Spirit. If anyone could help, if anyone could speak to God on her behalf, it was him. She fell at his feet, breathless, the dust of the road on her face, her dignity forgotten in her panic.
Your servant, my husband, is dead. And you know that your servant feared the Lord.
Hear what she is saying. She isn't just stating a fact. She is pleading a case. She is reminding God of his covenant. She is saying, "We were faithful. We served you. My husband gave his life for this ministry. Don't you see us? Have you forgotten us?"
But the creditor has come to take my 2 children to serve him.
There it was, the ugly truth laid bare. She was about to lose her future. Elisha's response is fascinating. In our modern world, we expect a bailout. We expect someone to write a check to fix the problem from the outside. But God rarely works from the outside in. He works from the inside out. Elisha looks at her with compassion, but he doesn't reach into his robe and pull out a bag of gold. He doesn't write a letter to the king demanding justice. Instead, he invites her into the solution. He forces her to stop looking at what she lost and start looking at what she has left.
What shall I do for you?
Tim.
Tell me, what do you have in the house?
It seemed like a cruel question, a mocking question. What did she have? She had debt. She had grief. She had fear. She had an empty house that echoed with the memories of better days. She almost said, nothing. It was on the tip of her tongue.
Your servant has nothing in the house.
But then she remembered a small detail, a forgotten item.
Except a jar of oil.
It wasn't a barrel. It wasn't a vat. It was an such, a flask, just a tiny amount of olive oil. To her, it was the last scrap of her livelihood, perhaps the last remnant of her dignity. It was nothing compared to the mountain of debt she owed. But to God, it was enough. God never starts with what you don't have. He always starts with what you do have, even if it seems like nothing, even if it seems insufficient. Elisha looked at her. He didn't see a jar of oil. He saw a seed, and he gave her a command that sounded completely illogical, a command that required active, embarrassing, public faith.
Go, borrow vessels from everywhere, from all your neighbors, empty vessels. Do not gather just a few.
Think about this strategy. If you are in debt, the last thing you want to do is knock on your neighbor's door and ask for favors. You want to hide your shame. You want to keep your poverty a secret. But Elisha told her to go public. Go to everyone, the baker, the potter, the friend down the street. And don't ask for food. Don't ask for money. Ask for their empty trash. Ask for their empty pots, their pans, their vases, their jugs. And, Elisha warned, do not gather just a few. The prophet was telling her, the size of your miracle will be determined by the size of your preparation.
And when you have come in, you shall shut the door behind you and your sons. Then pour it into all those vessels and set aside what is full.
Shut the door. Why? Why shut the door? Because some miracles are not for the show. Some miracles are sacred. This wasn't a magic trick for the marketplace. This was a moment of intimacy between a widow and her God. The world was shut out. The creditor with his demands was shut out. The mocking neighbors were shut out. The doubting voices were shut out. It was just the widow, her sons, a floor covered in borrowed pottery, and the presence of Jehovah Jireh, the Lord who provides. The widow wiped her tears. She looked at her boys. She saw the fear in their eyes, but now she also saw a spark of curiosity. She grabbed their hands. Run, she told them. Go to every house. Beg if you have to. Get the jars. Imagine the scene in the village. The boys running back and forth, carrying heavy clay pots. The neighbors whispering, "Why does she need so many pots? She has no grain to put in them. She has no wine. Has grief driven her mad?" It was a task that required her to expose her emptiness to the community. It was a walk of humility, but she collected them. One by one, the floor of her small house began to disappear. A sea of ceramic, stone, and clay spread across the room. Tall jars, wide bowls, cracked pitchers. The boys locked the door. The heavy wooden bolt slid into place. The light in the room was dim, filtering through the small windows. The air was thick with anticipation. She picked up her small flask. Her hand trembled. She looked at the first large, empty vessel sitting on the floor. A jar that could hold 5, maybe 10 times what she held in her hand. It was impossible. The math didn't work. But she didn't look at the math. She looked at the word of the Lord. She tipped her small flask. The golden liquid poured out. It hit the bottom of the big jar with a distinct wet sound. She watched it pool. She expected the trickle to stop. Physics dictates that once her small flask was empty, the flow would cease. She watched the oil rise in the big jar. Quarter full, half full. She shook the flask slightly. It still felt heavy. The oil was still coming, full. She gasped. She looked at her sons. Their mouths were open, in shock. "Bring me another vessel." Her son slid a pitcher under the stream. She didn't tilt her flask back. She didn't dare stop. She just kept pouring. The oil flowed like a river from a source that shouldn't exist. It was defying every law of nature. It was the creative power of God at work, the same power that multiplied the loaves and fish, the same power that spoke the universe into existence. 1 jar, full. 2 jars, full. 10, 20. The room began to change. The smell of poverty, the smell of dust and old fear was replaced by the aroma of provision. The heavy, rich, earthy scent of fresh olive oil saturated the air. In that culture, oil was liquid currency. It was light for the lamps. It was food for the table. It was medicine for the body. The boys were laughing now. The tears on the widow's face were no longer tears of terror, but tears of overwhelming joy. They were working hard, sweating, hauling heavy, sloshing jars aside and sliding empty ones into place. "Hurry," she said. "Another one." She was exhausted. Her arm ached from holding the flask. But she was exhilarated. She looked around. The floor was covered. Every borrowed pot, every cracked bowl, every neighbor's discarded vessel was brimming with pure golden oil.
"Bring me another vessel."
She waited for the next jar. She was ready to pour more. She was ready to fill the whole village. But her son stopped. He looked around the room, scanning every corner, looking under the table. He looked back at his mother with wide eyes. And the moment those words were spoken, something happened. The oil stopped. It didn't sputter. It didn't fade out. It just stopped. As soon as the capacity to receive ended, the supply ceased. This is the profound spiritual law of the miracle. The oil didn't stop because God ran out of resources. God owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. He owns the olive groves of the entire world. The oil didn't stop because the widow was tired. The oil stopped because they ran out of room to receive it. God's provision was exactly as large as their capacity to believe. If they had borrowed 10 more jars, 10 more would have been filled. If they had borrowed 100 more, 100 more would have been filled. The limitation was not in heaven's supply. The limitation was in the empty vessels on earth. She stood there in the sudden silence. The flask in her hand was finally light again, empty. But the room was full. She opened the door. The sunlight flooded in, illuminating the gold that covered her floor. The air smelled of olives and victory. She didn't stay there counting her wealth. She went back to the source. She went back to the man of God. She didn't just assume what to do with the blessing. She asked for wisdom on how to manage it. The debt was paid. The boys were safe. The creditor was silenced. The chains of slavery were broken before they could ever be forged. But look closer at the abundance. God didn't just give her enough to survive the day. He didn't just give her enough to pay the bill. He gave her enough to pay the debt and live on the rest. He moved her from poverty to stewardship. He moved her from a victim of the economy to a participant in it. She became a businesswoman, selling the finest oil in the region, providing for her family for years to come from one afternoon of obedience. This story is about more than just magic oil in ancient Israel. It is about you. It is about the principle of the empty vessel. We are often afraid of our emptiness. We try to hide our brokenness, our lack, our weakness. We paint over our cracks so the neighbors won't see. But in the kingdom of God, your emptiness is not a liability. It is a prerequisite. Bring your empty self to God and trust Him. Even a small faith can bring a miracle. He must increase. We must decrease. Shut the door, trust Him, and watch the oil flow. Like, share, and subscribe to Bible Toons Studio.